Hi, I'm Dr. Rick Duplantis, and you're watching It's Your Health. I want to thank you for tuning into my program tonight, It's Your Health. And tonight we're going to talk about a very unique issue, I guess you could say. We're in Lent now here at this time of the year, and with Holy Week, Good Friday, and Easter right around the corner, I'd like to shed light on a topic that is appropriate for this season, and I'd like to cover the death of our Savior Jesus Christ from the perspective of a medical examiner. I hope this program gives you some in-depth understanding the suffering and death of Christ from the various medical issues that were going on that occurred both during the scourging, as a result of the scourging, during the crucifixion as well. So, if you have young children, you might want them to leave the room at this time. Crucifixion was a very barbaric form of capital punishment practiced by the Romans, the Persians, and the Phoenicians, and as well the Egyptians. The word crucifixion is derived from the word cruciate, or to torture and torment. The Romans were well trained in every step of this technique. There were 5 soldiers assigned to each crucifixion. The team consisted of a centurion, we'll call the extractor mortis, who was in charge of the 4 soldiers. Jesus Christ's death on the cross was a study in the agony of man whose arms and legs, their major nerves possibly cut by spikes, the shot searing all the joints with pain throughout the body, already ravaged by a loss of a great quantity of blood, and from the severe whipping that Christ underwent. Having suffered for at least 3 hours, Jesus finally died on an unusually severe variety of blood loss-induced shock and a type of suffocation that normally resulted from crucifixion. In the end, he may have suffered a climactic heart seizure, perhaps brought on by a blood clot breaking loose inside the arteries and fatally damaging his heart muscle. More likely, perhaps, he suffered a final episode of acute heart failure caused by this catastrophic disturbance in the heart rhythm as well. If he did sustain a lance wound after he lost consciousness for the last time, the spear tip probably pierced the chest cavity, releasing a combination of blood and fluid that accumulated, worsening his asphyxiation and only adding to the suffering and pain. The end of the lance probably penetrated Jesus' heart too, but its effect was academic, for the man widely perceived as the Son of God was already dead before the Roman soldiers raised his weapon. Leading pathologists across the country to agree that the evaluation is interesting speculation, but not a final judgment. Indeed, questions to the deeply rooted in history and philosophy and theology as well cannot be resolved with total certainty. In fact, remarked famous pathologist and medical examiner Michael Baden, Deputy Chief Medical Examiner in New York City, not only is it impossible to draw reliable medical conclusions about Christ's death, but trying too hard to do so may hopelessly confuse faith and science. Baden has been involved in such prominent cases as the assassination of President John F. Kennedy and the drug death of comedian John Belushi. Noting that Jesus' death, noted Baden, was not just a representative crucifixion, but the best known of all time, he stated. There is something beautiful about faith, and it stands on its own feet. Conflict is created when one tries to give faith scientific underpinnings. There are 2 different kinds of belief. The words of medical examiner Michael Baden's words. Some of Baden's positions is similar to that of the Roman Catholic Church. It's noted professor noted that in church history in St. John's Seminary in Camillo, he's a professor of theology, he stated that in the final analysis, Eberhard said that if one assumes, as Christians do, that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, 20th century pathology is irrelevant because the crucifixion occurred under complete divine control. If the belief in the deity of Jesus is rejected, attempted sciences nearly 2,000 years after the fact can't be diagnostic anyway. This is by noted theologians. And irrespective of the relevance of science to such an inherently religious matter, doctors who have reviewed the new crucifixion pathology findings note that at least some of its science may rely for its definitive conclusions on medical evidence that is at least controversial or perhaps suspect. The main component of this chain of evidence is the Shroud of Turin, purported by many to be the actual burial cloth of Jesus Christ, whose authenticity remains unconfirmed, but new findings are occurring each year. Controversial for decades, the shroud still awaits what many believe to be the crucial evaluation in the form of radiocarbon dating that may help to resolve whether the fiber actually dates to the time of Christ. The Roman Catholic Church controls the shroud and has made it clear a decision of how or if the shroud will be scientifically dated may not be made for another year or so. If the shroud is the burial cloth of Christ and contains an image of his body at the time of burial, it could confirm more scientifically than anything else the nature and type of injuries he sustained, and to tell us something about the overall physical appearance. So we have only concise words of evangelists such as Pilate, having scourged Jesus, delivered him to them to be crucified, and they crucified him. It's impossible to discuss the infinite psychic and spiritual suffering of the incarnate God, atoning for the sins of fallen man. But it seemed to me that as a physician, we might pursue the physiological and anatomical aspects of our Lord's passion and death in some detail. What did the body of Jesus of Nazareth actually endure during those long hours of agony and torture? Apparently, the first known practice of crucifixion, like I said, was by the Persians. Alexander and his generals brought it back to the Mediterranean world, to Egypt, to Carthage. The Romans apparently learned this practice from the Carthaginians. Rapidly they developed a very high degree of efficiency and skill at crucifixion. There's a great deal of speculation on the crucifixion process. For instance, the upright portion of the cross, could have been a cross arm, or we call patabulum. It's attached 2 or 3 feet below the top of what we commonly think of as the Latin cross that we see in artwork. The most common form used in our Lord's day for crucifixion was a tau cross, spelled T-A-U. It's shaped like our T. In this cross, the patabulum was placed in a notch at the top of the stipes, which is the long board or trunk of the cross itself. Hi, I'm Dr. Rick Duplantis, and today we're talking about atrial fibrillation. You know that the human heart beats over 100,000 times a day. At that pace, it's no wonder you might feel that your heart may skip a beat or flutter from time to time. However, if you notice your heart suddenly races, or if you have an uneven heartbeat that lasts several minutes, you may have a condition known as atrial fibrillation. Atrial fibrillation, also called AFib, is a problem with the rate or rhythm of the heartbeat. Your heart's electrical system tells your heart when to contract and when to pump the blood to the rest of your body. With AFib, these electrical signals short circuit in a sense, or so to speak. The result is a chaotic, rapid heart rate. You might feel short of breath with this, dizzy, or overly tired, although not everyone has these symptoms. If you have AFib, it's important to remember you're not alone. AFib affects more than 3 million Americans each year. If untreated, atrial fib can lead to blood clots, stroke, and heart failure. In fact, people with AFib are 5 times more likely to have a stroke than people without this condition. And if you feel you are one of these individuals suffering from atrial fib, please see your doctor right away. I'm Dr. Rick Duplantis. Have a great day. Hi, I'm Dr. Rick Duplantis, and we're talking about sudden cardiac death today. First of all, what is cardiac death, or sudden cardiac death, more or less? Sudden cardiac death can result from a sudden cardiac arrest, when your heart stops, when the heart suddenly and unexpectedly stops beating. This is a heart attack. Sudden cardiac arrest must be immediately addressed with CPR and medical attention to improve the chances of survival. So who is at most risk for these sudden cardiac death incidents? Men are 2 to 3 times more likely to have sudden cardiac arrest than women. The risk also increases with age, particularly in those with heart disease or other cardiovascular conditions such as arrhythmia or heart failure. It's important to address any cardiovascular risk factors or conditions to reduce risk for sudden cardiac arrest and death. Be sure to have regular yearly checkups with your doctor, and if you feel you have a heart issue, please see your doctor at once. I'm Dr. Rick Duplantis. Have a great day. And we're back, and I want to continue on. The most common form of crucifix used in our Lord's day was what we call a tau, T-A-U cross. It's shaped like our T. Okay, in this cross, the patibulum, which is the crossbar, was placed in a notch at the very top of what we call the stipes. And it was there, this archaeological evidence, that it was on this type of cross that Jesus was crucified. Without any historical or biblical proof, medieval and Renaissance painters have given us our picture of Christ carrying the entire cross. But the upright post, called the stipes, was generally fixed permanently in the ground at the site of the execution, and the condemned man was forced to carry the patibulum. Now, this was no light task, because it weighed about 110 pounds, and you had to carry this from the prison, the condemned did, from the prison to the place of execution. Many of the painters and most of the sculptures of the crucifixion also show the nails through the palms of the hand. Historically, Roman accounts and experimental work have established that the nails were driven between the small bones of the wrist, between the radius and the ulna, and not through the palms. Nails driven through the palms would strip out between the fingers, and which we made it to support the weight of the human body. It cannot support that weight. This is a misconception that may have come about through a misunderstanding of Jesus' words to Thomas, "Observe my hands." Now, anatomists, both modern and ancient, have always considered the wrist to be part of the hand. A small sign stating the victim's crime was usually placed on a staff and carried in front of the procession from the prison and later nailed to the cross so that it extended above the head of the condemned man. This sign, with its staff nailed to the top of the cross, would have given it somewhat the characteristic form of the Latin cross that we see in art today. Now that brings our attention to the agony in the garden, and the suffering and the agony of the Garden of Gethsemane. The physical passion of Christ began in Gethsemane. Of the many aspects of this initial suffering, one of the greatest physiological interests is the bloody sweat, that Christ sweat blood in the Garden of Gethsemane. One of the many aspects of this initial suffering, one of the greatest physiological interests, is the bloody sweat, that Christ was perspiring blood. It is interesting that St. Luke, who was a physician actually, is the only one to mention this. He says, "And being in agony, he prayed the longer, and his sweat became as drops of blood, trickling down upon the ground." Every trick imaginable has been used by modern scholars to explain away this description, apparently under the mistaken impression that it just doesn't happen. A great deal of effort could have been saved by doubters consulting medical literature. Though very rare, the phenomena of hematidrosis, which is bloody sweat, is well documented. Under great emotional stress of any kind, and the kind suffered by our Lord, the tiny capillaries in the sweat glands can rupture, thus mixing blood with sweat. This process might well have produced the marked weakness and possible shock that Christ experienced in the Garden of Gethsemane, and introduced to the audience the term hematidrosis, the sweating of blood. This medical condition is defined in Steedman's Medical Dictionary as an excretion of blood or blood pigments in the sweat. Hematidrosis is associated with severe anxiety and a severe anxiety reaction by fear. Reportedly, Jesus was able to envision the entire gamut of suffering that was to come. This prelude produced all of the medical criteria to initiate the sympathetic autonomic response, as well as the severe counter parasympathetic response, which would cause severe dilation and rupture of the blood vessels into the sweat glands, thus causing Christ to sweat blood in the Garden of Gethsemane. After the arrest of Christ, in the middle of the night, Jesus was brought before the Sanhedrin and Caiaphas, the high priest. It is here that the first physical trauma was inflicted to Christ. A soldier struck Jesus across the face for remaining silent when questioned by Caiaphas. The palace guards then blindfolded him and mockingly taunted him to identify them as they each passed by, spat upon him, and struck him in the face. In the early morning, they battered and bruised and dehydrated and exhausted from a sleepless night, Jesus taken across the Praetorium to the fortress of Antonia, the seat of government for the procurator of Judea, Pontius Pilate. Now, Pilate, by his actions, was attempting to pass responsibility on to Herod Antipas, but the tetrarch of Judea. Jesus apparently suffered no physical mistreatment at the hands of Herod, and he was returned to Pilate. It was then, in response to the cries of the mob, that Pilate ordered Barabbas to be released and condemned Jesus to scourging and crucifixion. There is much disagreement among authorities about the unusual scourging as a prelude to crucifixion. Many scholars believe that Pilate originally ordered Jesus scourged as his full punishment, and that the death sentence by crucifixion came all in response to the taunts of a mob. Preparations for the scourging were carried out when the prisoner was stripped of his clothing and his hands were tied to a post above his head. It's doubtful if the Romans would have made any attempt to follow the Jewish law in this matter, but the Jews had an ancient law prohibiting more than 40 lashes. The Roman legionnaire steps forward with a flagellum in his hand, and this is a short whip. It consists of several heavy leather thongs with two small lead balls attached near the ends. Each heavy whip was brought down with full force, again and again across Christ's shoulders, back, and legs. These thongs cut through the skin only. Then, as the blows continued, they cut deeper into the subcutaneous tissues, producing first an oozing of blood, from the capillaries and veins of the skin, and finally spurting arterial bleeding from vessels and the underlying muscles. These small lead balls led to produce large, deep bruises, which were broken open by subsequent blows. Finally, the skin of the back is hanging in long ribbons, and the entire area is an unrecognizable mass of torn, bleeding tissue when it's all over with. When it is determined by the centurion in charge that the prisoner is near death, the beating is finally stopped. The half-fainting Jesus is then untied and allowed to slump to the stone pavement, wet with his own blood. The Roman soldiers see a great joke in their provincial Jew claiming to be king. They throw a robe across his shoulders and they place a stick in his hand as a scepter. They still need a crown to make their travesty complete. Flexible branches covered with long thorns, commonly used in bundles for firewood, are plaited into the shape of a crown, and this is pressed on the scalp of Christ. Again, there is copious bleeding. The scalp being one of the most vascular areas of the body, he begins to bleed profusely from the wounds in the head. After mocking Christ and striking him across the face, the soldiers made a stick, from his hand, and they strike him across the head with it, driving the thorns deeper into the scalp. Finally, they tire of their sadistic sport, and the robe is torn from his back. Now, he already had this blood adhering to the robe, and clots of blood and serum of the wounds, and this removal of this cloak caused excruciating pain, just as the careless removal of a surgical bandage, and almost as though he were again bleeding from this and being whipped again. The wounds were once more opened and were bleeding profusely. Jesus, who was already weak from his hematidrosis and the hypovolemic shock, as well as the lancinating pains from the crown of thorns, was forced to carry his own cross. Like I said, the patabulum, the crossbar, weighs 110 pounds. Now, after undergoing this great loss of blood, loss of fluids in his body, he's hypovolemic, he's very weak, in other words, and so he's made to carry 110 pounds across his shoulders, probably for some 600 yards. Okay, the difference to the Jewish custom, the Romans returned his garments, and the heavy patabulum, of the cross is tied across his shoulders, and the procession of the condemned Christ, the two thieves, and the execution detail of Roman soldiers headed by the centurion begins their journey to the Via Dolorosa. In spite of his efforts to walk erect, the weight of the heavy wooden beam, together with the shock produced by this copious loss of blood, is too much. Christ stumbles from weakness and falls to the ground. This exhaustion was accompanied by dyspnea, which is shortness of breath. Probably pleural fluid accumulation within his lungs made it very difficult to breathe, and he also probably had a possible pneumothorax due to the scourging. The intense heat and the weight of the cross that caused him to fall. You can only imagine the pain and suffering and weakness that he must have experienced in this journey. The extractor Martus, or the head of the centurion's soldiers, could not allow Jesus to die before the crucifixion, so Simon of Cyrene was designated to carry the patabulum for Jesus. This rough wood of the beam gouges into the lacerated skin and muscles of the shoulders. He tries to rise, but human muscles have been pushed beyond their endurance, plus the weakness and loss of blood. The centurion, anxious to get on with the crucifixion, selected Simon of Cyrene. He's a North African onlooker to carry the cross for Jesus. Jesus follows, still bleeding and sweating, cold, clammy skin of shock, until the 650-yard journey from the fortress Antonia to Golgotha is finally completed. Now Jesus is offered wine mixed with myrrh, a mild analgesic mixture, and he refuses to drink. Now Simon is ordered to place the patablum on the ground, and Jesus is quickly thrown backward on his shoulders against the wood. Now, all this comes after the beating, the scars on his back, the torn flesh on his back, carrying of the patablum on his shoulders as far as he could carry it with the existing loss of blood. And then he's thrown on the ground, thrown his shoulders to land on this crossbeam of wood. This patablum weighs about 110 pounds. And then a large spike nailed, measuring about 4 3/4 inches, were nailed through the palm of each hand, just below the base of the thumb. This is nailed between the radius and the ulna, and nailed in the wrist. The pain would have been brutal, and you would have like a hot poker traversing the arms, causing Christ to arch his torso from the severe pain of the driving of these nails into his hands. Two of the centurions grabbed the ends of the crosspiece, while the third member grasped Jesus around the waist, getting him to his feet, backing him upright to the large beam, and then other two lift Jesus by his legs, and then they insert the crosspiece into the mortise or the top of the upright beam. The knees of Christ were then bent until his feet were flush to the cross, and his feet were nailed into the cross. Jesus would likely have cried out in agony as each foot was nailed. It takes me to the psalm, "They have pierced my hands and my feet. I can number all my bones." Psalms 22, 16 to 17 verse. The legionnaire feels for the depression at the front of the wrist. Then he drives this heavy square wrought iron nail through the wrist and deep into the wood. Quickly, the centurion would move to the other side and repeat the action, being careful not to pull the arms too tightly, but to allow some flexion and movement. The patablum was then lifted in place at the top of the stipes, which is the upright beam, and the sign reads on top of this, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," was nailed in place above the head of Christ. Now the left foot is now pressed backward against the right foot, and both feet extended, toes down. A nail is driven through the arch of each foot, leaving the knees moderately flexed. Now the victim is now crucified. As he slowly sags down his body with more weight on the nails in the wrist, causing excruciating pain, shooting along the fingers, up into the arms, and explodes into the brain. The nails in the wrist are putting pressure on the median nerves, causing the thumbs to be in the downward flex position. Now, as Christ pushes himself upward to avoid the stretching torment, he places his full weight on the nail through his feet, causing a great deal of agony and suffering. Again, there is the searing agony of the nail tearing through the nerves between the metatarsal bones of the feet. At this point, the arms fatigue. There are great waves of cramp sweeping over the muscles. He's lost a lot of fluid, a lot of blood, knotting them up in deep, relentless, throbbing pain in the musculature of Christ. With these muscle cramps comes the inability to push himself upward. Hanging by his arms and pectoral muscles, they are paralyzed, and the intercostal muscles are unable to act and move to bring in air. Air can be drawn into the lungs, but he cannot exhale due to this paralysis. Jesus would fight to rise himself in order to get even one short breath, to raise the body up to great effort. Finally, you get carbon dioxide builds up in the lungs and in the bloodstream as well. And these cramps particularly will subside. Spasmodically, he is unable to push himself forward and upward to exhale any longer and bring in the life-giving oxygen. It was undoubtedly during these periods that he uttered the 7 short sentences recorded The first, looking down at the Roman soldiers throwing dice for his seamless garment, Christ said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." The second thing he said was to the penitent thief, who said, "Today thou shalt be with me in paradise." Then the third sentence Christ uttered was, looking down at the terrified, grief-stricken adolescent John, his apostle, the beloved apostle, he said, "Behold thy mother." Then looking to his mother Mary, he said, "Behold thy son." The fourth cry is from the beginning of the 22nd Psalm, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Jesus experienced hours of relentless, unlimited pain. Cycles of twisting, joint-rendering cramps, intermittent partial asphyxiation, searing pain where tissues were torn from his lacerated back as he moves up and down against this rough timber in an attempt to breathe. Then another agony begins, a terrible crushing deep pain in the chest as the pericardium slowly fills with serum and begins to compress the heart, cardiac tamponade, as it's known in medicine. One remembers again the 22nd Psalm, I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted in the midst. Now it's almost over. The loss of tissue fluid has reached a critical level. The compressed heart of Jesus is struggling to pump heavy, thick, sluggish blood into the tissues. The tortured lungs are making a frantic effort at this point to gasp in small gulps of air, but it's very difficult. The markedly dehydrated tissues send their flood of stimuli to the brain, and Jesus gasped his fifth cry, I thirst. You know, thinking of the 22nd Psalm, my strength is dried up like a, and thou hast brought me to this dust of death. A sponge is soaked, and it's cheap sour wine, which is a staple to drink by Roman legionaries. It's lifted up to the lips of Christ. He apparently does not take any of the liquid. The body of Jesus is now in extreme pain, and he can feel the chill of death creeping through his tissue. This realization brings out the sixth word, possibly little more than a tortured whisper that Christ whispers, it is finished. His mission of atonement is completed. Finally, he can allow his body to die. With one last surge of strength, he once again presses his torn feet against the nail, straightens his legs, takes a deep breath, and utters his seventh and last cry, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. In order that the Sabbath not be profaned, the Jews asked the condemned men to be dispatched and removed from the crosses. The common method of ending a crucifixion was by crucifracture, which is breaking the bones of the legs. This prevented the victim from pushing himself upward. Thus, the tension could not be relieved from the muscles of the chest, and rapid suffocation would occur. They would die from asphyxiation in crucifixion due to the inability to breathe. And the legs were broken in the end if they had not died yet, and so they would suffocate. The legs of the two thieves were broken, but when the soldiers came to Jesus, they saw that this was unnecessary. Apparently, to make doubly sure of his death, one of the legionaries drove his lance through the fifth intercostal space of the ribs, upward through the pericardium, and through the sheath around the encasing the heart, and into the heart itself. And this goes to the 34th verse, 19th chapter, the Gospel according to St. John reports, and immediately there came out blood and water. That is, there was an escape of water and fluid from the sac surrounding the heart, giving post-mortem evidence that our Lord had died, not the usual crucifixion death by suffocation, but of heart failure due to shock and constriction of the heart by fluid in the pericardium, cardiac tamponade. When one considers each phase of Jesus' suffering, beginning at Gethsemane and ending at Calvary, the forensic conclusion is that Jesus died of shock. Jesus had experienced hematidrosis, which is the sweating of blood, prior to being viciously scourged and severely flogged. This caused extensive damage to the lungs, the ribs, and the body cavity, thereby throwing him into early shock manifested by extreme weakness, tremors, probable lung collapse, seizures, and fainting. Add all this mental anguish, the crowning of thorns, the carrying of the cross, the piece of the cross, the patibulum, and the crucifixion process, and anyone with a background in forensic pathology or emergency medicine would wonder how Jesus lasted as long as he did. There are various types of shock. Hypovolemic shock is a shock marked by a significant fall in blood volume due to hemorrhage or loss of body fluids. Traumatic shock, of course, injury shock, results from a serious injury. The presence of pain, alone from traumatic events, stimulates certain nervous mechanisms in the brain, resulting in a drop of blood pressure and a reduction in blood flow to the tissues. Now, Jesus suffered severe blood and fluid losses as well as excruciating pain. The scourging resulted in penetration of the skin with trauma to the nerves, muscles, probably rib fractures, dislocations, lacerations, with a significant amount of blood loss and throughout the body, great scarring, great pain, severe pain, and bruises. Over a short period of time, an inflammation of the sac of the heart, termed pericarditis, would have ensued, manifested by the stabbing pains in the chest. The irritation of the trigeminal nerve of the scalp from the crown of thorns would have caused pain across the scalp and face. This would have added to the state of traumatic shock from the scourging. The splinting of the chest wall and the causalgia from the nailing of the hands and feet also added to traumatic shock that Christ suffered. As Jesus hung on the cross, with the weight of his body pulling on the nails in the hands and feet, there would have been episodes in the chest wall of scourging which would have worsened the state of traumatic and hypovolemic shock, increasing pleural effusion. He would have had swelling in his lungs. His lungs would have filled up with fluid. Excessive swelling was induced by the trauma as well as the heat of the sun. As Jesus would have arched his body to relieve the cramps in his legs and his arms, he would have had to press his head with the crown of thorns against the upright beam. And this would have reactivated the trigeminal neuralgia, causing severe facial pain and head pain. I hope that you have gained a little bit more understanding from the medical examiner standpoint of the suffering and death of Jesus Christ and what he endured for the atonement of mankind. I'm Dr. Rick Duplantis. I want to wish you a very happy Easter and a very pleasant evening. Good night.